I've spent 40 years of my life pouring concrete, framing load-bearing walls, and pulling permits for commercial high-rises across the Seattle skyline. And if there is one absolute truth I've learned, it's that a structure is only as resilient as the foundation buried beneath the dirt. You can dress a building in all the imported glass and polished steel you want, but if the foundation is cracked, the entire thing will eventually come down under its own weight. I thought I had built a solid, impenetrable foundation for Julian. Sitting alone in the dim light of my kitchen on the night of his college graduation, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the metallic ping of my 20-year-old heavy-duty work truck cooling off in the driveway, I finally admitted how wrong I was. I wasn't at the commencement ceremony today. I wasn't invited to the lavish catered dinner happening right now in some velvet-roped VIP room downtown. Exactly 1 week ago, Julian had stood in this very kitchen, looked at my worn leather work boots, my calloused hands, and the faded flannel shirt I've worn 100 times, and quietly informed me that my look didn't fit the aesthetic of his new life. He was celebrating his business degree with Preston and Eleanor Sterling, his biological parents, the flashy real estate socialites who had conveniently remembered he existed 6 months ago, right as he was about to graduate with honors. I hadn't argued when he told me to stay home. I just nodded, swallowed the massive lump of grief in my throat, and told him I was proud of him. So I sat there in the silence of the craftsman home I had built entirely with my own 2 hands, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, waiting for a son who was currently busy trying to forget my name. The heavy oak front door groaned open just past midnight. Julian walked in, bringing the smell of expensive cologne and stale champagne into the quiet house. He was wearing a slim-cut, charcoal gray designer suit that easily cost more than the transmission in my truck, his hair styled perfectly, his posture stiff and defensive. He didn't look at me as he strode directly into the kitchen, his leather dress shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor I had laid piece by piece when he was 5 years old. He stopped on the opposite side of the kitchen island, reached into the inner breast pocket of his jacket, and pulled out a thick, bulging manila envelope. He didn't hand it to me. He slapped it down onto the butcher block counter with a heavy, dismissive thud. "What's this, Julian?" I asked, keeping my voice lower and steadier than the pounding rhythm of my own heart. He didn't blink. $5,000. Cash, he said, his tone dripping with a rehearsed cold arrogance that I didn't recognize. It covers the last semester of tuition you paid out of pocket. We're square. I looked down at the envelope and slowly looked back up at the boy I had raised since he was a terrified 4-year-old foster kid, the boy who used to ride shotgun in the cab of my rig, eating powdered donuts and pointing out the towering construction cranes, telling me he wanted to build cities with me when he grew up. Square? I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. Yeah, Arthur, square, he snapped, crossing his arms over his expensive chest, looking at me like I was a stranger who had just tracked mud onto his pristine carpet. You raised me like a peasant. You made me think we had to scrape by, clipping coupons and sweating over every electric bill, driving that rusted-out piece of junk you call a truck while the rest of the world actually lived. Keep the change. My real family owns the skyline now. He didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and marched down the hallway to his childhood bedroom. For the next hour, I sat frozen in the kitchen, listening to the chaotic sounds of him yanking hangers out of the closet, throwing things into duffel bags, and zipping luggage. I didn't get up to yell. I didn't chase him down the hall to demand respect. I just sat there, staring at the $5,000 in cash, quietly bearing the crushing weight of his ignorance. If he only knew the actual size of the commercial real estate empire I managed from my small, cluttered office downtown, he might have stayed. But I had always believed in quiet security over loud wealth, hoping to teach him the value of $1 rather than the entitlement of a fortune. When he finally walked out the front door, he didn't say goodbye, and he didn't look back. He just slammed the heavy door shut, the sound echoing violently through the empty house. The following evening, the silence of the house felt less like peace and more like a vacuum, pulling the air right out of my lungs. I finally forced myself to walk into his bedroom to begin the agonizing task of clearing out the life he had decided to abandon. I had barely unfolded the first cardboard box when the doorbell rang. It was Elena Cortez, my 26-year-old office manager and junior estimator at Vance Commercial Builders. She was a former neighborhood kid I'd mentored through high school, sharp as a tack, fiercely loyal, and currently standing on my front porch with a giant box of heavy-duty contractor trash bags and 2 large coffees. "You're off the clock, Elena," I told her, blocking the doorway with my broad shoulders. "It's past 7. Go home." She didn't budge. "Try and stop me, Mr. Vance," she said, pushing right past me into the foyer with a stubborn set to her jaw. "You're not doing this alone. Hand me a roll of packing tape." We worked in relative silence for an hour, boxing up old college textbooks, high school sports trophies, and the accumulated detritus of a life Julian had deemed unworthy of his new aristocratic pedigree. He had only taken his newly purchased designer clothes, his expensive electronics, and his watches. Everything else was left behind to be thrown away. I was kneeling beside the small trash can in the corner of the room, pulling out handfuls of crumpled paper when my fingers brushed against something heavy, stiff, and distinctly made of leather. I pulled it out, and the air completely left my chest. It was the custom-tooled leather tool belt I had made for him by hand when he was 10 years old. I had spent 3 weeks of evenings cutting the hide, punching the rivets, and tooling his initials into the front pouch so he could feel like a real worker on the job site with me. It was worn now, the leather darkened and supple from years of weekend projects, but he had tossed it directly into the garbage. I held it in my calloused hands, my thumbs tracing his initials, feeling a tight, painful knot form in my throat. "He really didn't leave anything of us, did he?" I murmured, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Elena paused, placing a stack of books into a box, and looked over at me with a soft, sad expression. "He's chasing a ghost, Arthur," she said quietly. "People like that. They always figure out the hard way what things actually cost." I nodded slowly, placing the tool belt carefully under the bare mattress. Beside the trash can lay a crumpled, dark blue blazer, one of his older, cheaper ones from sophomore year, discarded in a heap like a used rag. I picked it up to toss it into the donation pile, but a stiff rigidity in the inner breast pocket caught my attention. I reached inside and pulled out a thickly folded sheaf of papers. It looked like a legal document. I carried it over to the desk, smoothed out the heavy creases under the glow of the reading lamp, and began to read. The bold heading at the top of the first page read, "Operating Agreement, Sterling Vance Holdings, LLC." I adjusted my reading glasses and scanned the paragraphs. I am not a lawyer. But you don't survive 40 years in commercial development without learning how to read a contract, spot a liability loophole, and identify a structural trap. My contractor's eye immediately recognized the architecture of what I was looking at. It was an expedited shell company. The Sterlings were transferring massive, vaguely defined portfolios of highly distressed commercial assets into this newly formed entity. But it was the final page that made the blood freeze in my veins. There, highlighted in bright yellow ink, was the signature line for the sole managing member and the exclusive personal guarantor of all associated corporate debt, Julian Vance. They weren't welcoming a long-lost son into their billionaire empire. They were building a legal firewall to protect themselves, and they were shoving Julian right into the center of the flames. If these toxic assets failed, and looking at the sheer volume of the debt transfer, they were absolutely going to fail. Julian would be held personally, legally, and financially liable for everything. The Sterlings would walk away totally clean, leaving the peasant son to take the fall for their corporate collapse. I stared at the yellow highlighted line, the knot of fatherly grief in my chest instantly hardening into the cold, calculating resolve of a master builder discovering a catastrophic flaw in a blueprint. The peasant had raised him, but the contractor was going to protect him. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed Marcus Thorne, my corporate attorney. He answered on the second ring. "Marcus," I said, my voice dangerously steady, "we need to pull every public record on the Sterling portfolio right now. I think they're trying to restructure their debt, and they're using my son as the load-bearing wall." The air inside the Vance Commercial Builders office always smelled like sawdust, rolled blueprints, and stale, dark roast coffee, a familiar scent that usually brought me peace. But at 5:30 in the morning on a Tuesday, it only felt heavy and suffocating. Elena was already sitting at her desk when I unlocked the front door. the harsh blue light from her dual monitors illuminating her face as she rapidly typed, having completely ignored my strict orders to stay off the clock. I didn't say a word as I walked over, pulling up a heavy wooden drafting stool beside her desk and handing her a fresh cup of coffee. I pulled the King County property tax assessments, the state corporate registry filings, and the open mechanics liens, she said, not even looking up as her fingers flew across the keyboard, opening tab after tab of complicated legal jargon. Arthur, it's worse than a bad foundation. It's a complete sinkhole. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the digital documents, my mind automatically translating the financial data into structural terms, and what I saw was a high-rise built on sand, actively swaying in the wind. The Sterlings loved to project the image of untouchable Seattle royalty, but their flagship developments downtown were hopelessly stalled, bleeding money and suffocating under the weight of unpaid subcontractors and aggressive short-term loans. Look at this new entity they registered last week, Elena said, tapping the tip of her pen against the glass screen, pointing to a company called Sterling Vance Holdings LLC, the exact name printed on the crumpled draft I had pulled from Julian's trash. They are currently in aggressive negotiations for a corporate merger with the Vanguard family, old Seattle money, using Julian's upcoming engagement to a Vanguard daughter as the smokescreen. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the bitter taste grounding me as I realized the absolute malice of their architecture. They were staging a high society marriage of convenience to merge assets, but before the ink could dry on the marital contracts, they were quietly funneling all of their most toxic, defaulted commercial debt into the newly formed LLC. I thanked Elena, gathered the thick stack of printed public records, and drove my vintage Ford truck straight into the heart of downtown, parking in a subterranean garage surrounded by imported sports cars, before taking the private elevator up to the 40th floor. Marcus Thorne, my corporate attorney and one of the only men on earth who knew the actual depth of my financial reserves, was waiting for me in a sprawling, glass-walled conference room that overlooked the very skyline my son falsely believed his new parents owned. Marcus, an impeccably dressed man in his late 60s, didn't bat an eye at my scuffed steel-toe work boots tracking faint traces of drywall dust onto his imported Persian rug. He adjusted his reading glasses, took the crumpled draft LLC agreement from my calloused hands, and cross-referenced it with the massive stack of public filings Elena had printed. "Your instincts are entirely correct, Arthur," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a low, grim register as he removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Preston and Eleanor Sterling are functionally insolvent, operating on fumes and fraudulent appearances, and they are setting your boy up for a catastrophic fall." He explained that the lavish engagement gala they were frantically organizing wasn't a celebration of a reunited family. It was a highly orchestrated, desperate signing ceremony designed to legally transfer their massive corporate liabilities onto my son's shoulders. By making Julian the sole managing member and personal guarantor of Sterling Vance Holdings, they are building a legal firewall, Marcus continued, tapping the document. "When the debt inevitably crushes the company, the creditors will pierce the corporate veil and go directly after Julian's personal assets and future earnings, leaving the Sterlings legally insulated to walk away clean." I stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the steel cranes dotting the horizon, a cold, protective rage settling over me, but it was quickly replaced by a dark, familiar satisfaction when Marcus pulled up the master creditor list for the primary mezzanine loans currently suffocating the Sterling empire. 5 years ago, when Preston and Eleanor Sterling had first blipped on my radar as high-risk predatory developers known for exploiting young contractors, I had instructed my secondary holding company to quietly purchase their distressed debt portfolio at a steep, unpublicized discount. I hadn't done it to turn a profit. I had done it simply to maintain a distant, protective oversight over the strangers who had abandoned my boy at birth, ensuring that I always held the ultimate inescapable leverage if they ever decided to return and try to ruin his life. "Arthur," Marcus said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face as he turned his laptop screen toward me. "You currently hold the primary first position liens on their entire fraudulent empire, and the original loan covenants are ironclad." He pointed to a specific clause buried deep within the 50-page contract. explaining that any fraudulent transfer of assets or any attempt to restructure the debt into a new shell company without my explicit written permission would trigger an immediate callable default on the entire $18 million. Before I could instruct Marcus on the exact legal timeline of executing that default, my cell phone suddenly buzzed on the polished mahogany table, the bright screen flashing Julian's name, sending a foolish, stubborn sliver of paternal hope straight into my chest. I thought that maybe, just maybe, the boy had woken up in a cold sweat, realized the gravity of what he had done the night before, and was calling to apologize. I answered the phone immediately, but the voice on the other end wasn't apologetic. It was frantic, breathless, and entirely consumed by an artificial panic over his own manufactured image. "Arthur, listen to me. I need you to sign over the title deed to the '72 Ford truck right now," Julian demanded, the chaotic background noise of a luxury car dealership echoing behind his voice. He didn't ask how I was doing. He just launched into a manic explanation about how he needed to liquidate the vintage truck for quick cash because he was standing in a showroom trying to lease a European sports car. "I have to look the part for the engagement gala," he insisted, his voice cracking with deep, pathetic insecurity. "Everyone in the Sterling family drives imports, and I can't show up looking like some charity case who doesn't have any liquid assets of his own." I sat in the silent, glass-walled boardroom, looking at the legal documents that proved his new family was actually bankrupt, and I took a deep, steadying breath. "Julian, true wealth is never built on leased appearances and borrowed time," I told him calmly. "I'm not giving you the truck." The line went completely, agonizingly dead silent for 10 seconds, the weight of my refusal hanging in the air before Julian finally snapped. "You are a suffocating, small-minded relic of a peasant," he spat, the venom in his voice so thick it made my chest ache. "You will never understand how the real world of power and influence actually works because you're too busy playing in the dirt. Stay away from the country club. Stay away from my life. I don't ever want to see you or hear from you again." The line disconnected with a sharp click, leaving me listening to the hollow dial tone as the very last ember of my grief finally burned away, leaving behind the cold, absolute clarity of a master contractor preparing to demolish a condemned building. I slowly lowered the phone, looked across the table at Marcus, and gave him the only instruction left to give. "Prepare the foreclosure paperwork, Marcus," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Clear your schedule for the night of the gala. We are going to crash a party and collect our debts." The builder's resolve. There's a specific grounding rhythm to a commercial job site, a chaotic symphony of idling diesel engines, whining impact drivers, and shouting foremen that usually manages to drown out whatever noise is rattling around in my own head. But over the next 2 weeks, as the countdown to the 21st of the month steadily ticked away, the dust and the sweat of my daily routine felt like a completely different universe compared to the manufactured fantasy my son was currently living in. I was standing in the mud of a new high-rise foundation in Bellevue, wearing my battered hard hat and running my calloused hands over the exposed rebar of a load-bearing column when Elena walked out of the site trailer holding her company iPad. She didn't say a word. She just handed me the screen, shielding the glare of the afternoon sun with her hand so I could see what she had pulled up. It was Julian's social media page. Over the past 14 days, his feed had transformed into a sickening, curated parade of leased luxury and artificial status that made my stomach turn. There were photos of him wearing European designer labels that cost more than a journeyman carpenter makes in a month, leaning casually against a late-model Maserati with temporary dealer tags still barely visible in the reflection of the bumper. There were videos of him clinking crystal champagne flutes in exclusive VIP lounges, surrounded by people who looked at him not as a friend, but as a newly discovered wallet. But it was the captions that truly revealed the depth of the rot in his foundation. Underneath a photo of him standing on the balcony of the Sterling's penthouse, he had typed, "Finally stepping into the legacy of my true bloodline. Thankful to be out of the dirt and back where I belong." I stared at the screen, the roar of a cement mixer idling 10 feet away suddenly fading into white noise. As I watched the boy I had raised completely erase 20 years of my sacrifice for a few dozen digital likes. He was publicly attributing his entire existence to a pair of desperate, bankrupt strangers, deliberately burying the memory of a father who had spent 2 decades breaking his back to ensure he never went to bed hungry. But as I handed the iPad back to Elena, I realized something profound had shifted inside my chest. The sharp, suffocating sting of a father's heartbreak was entirely gone, replaced by the cold, detached focus of a master inspector who had just discovered black mold eating through the floorboards. I was no longer grieving a lost son. I was simply observing a catastrophic structural failure right before the building collapsed. Elena and I spent the rest of those 2 weeks engaged in the quiet, meticulous work of preparing the demolition, tracking the Sterling's frantic legal maneuvers through the county database. Working late into the evening, long after the rest of the office had gone home, we mapped out exactly how Preston and Eleanor were planning to spring the trap. The Vanguard family, the old money Seattle aristocrats whose daughter Julian was suddenly engaged to, were completely unaware of the Sterlings' insolvency. The Sterlings were using the lavish engagement gala at the country club to project an image of absolute financial dominance, hoping the optics of merging with the Vanguards would keep their aggressive short-term creditors at bay for just a few more weeks. But underneath the champagne and the caviar, the gala served a far more sinister, practical purpose. Elena cross-referenced the newly filed corporate documents and pinpointed the exact timeline. The Sterlings were going to wait until the absolute climax of the party, when Julian was completely intoxicated by the public attention and the pressure of his new high society peers, to pull him into a private room and push the final Sterling Vance Holdings LLC operating agreement in front of him. It was a high-pressure sales tactic disguised as a family celebration. If Julian signed that piece of paper, he would instantly become the sole legal guarantor for $18 million of toxic debt. And the moment the banks realized the Vanguard merger was a smokescreen, the creditors would bypass the Sterlings entirely and legally annihilate my son. One evening, as the sky outside the office window bruised into a deep, heavy purple and the downtown streetlights began to flicker on, I sat at my drafting table with a clean cotton rag and a tin of neat's foot oil. I had pulled the worn leather tool belt out of the floor safe, and I was slowly, methodically rubbing the thick oil into the cracked hide, working it into the heavy seams and the brass rivets. The smell of the oil brought back a vivid, painful memory of a 10-year-old Julian standing proudly in the driveway, wearing the belt over his oversized jeans, asking me if he was holding the hammer the right way. I was so lost in the memory that I didn't hear Elena walk into the office until she quietly placed a fresh mug of coffee on the edge of my drafting table. She stood there for a long moment, watching me work the oil into the leather initials I had carved for him, her dark eyes reflecting the glowing monitors on her desk that were still filled with the Sterling's fraudulent tax filings. She didn't offer a hollow platitude or tell me that everything was going to work out. She just looked at the tool belt, then looked directly into my eyes, and spoke the words I had been too stubborn to admit to myself for the past 20 years. "You spent 20 years building him a safe foundation, Arthur," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet, fierce loyalty that Julian had never once possessed. "If he wants to jump off it, you have to let him fall." I stopped polishing the leather, my calloused fingers resting heavily against the brass buckle. The absolute truth of her words settled deep into my bones, a heavy, permanent weight dropping firmly into place. She was right. I had spent my entire life trying to shield him from the consequences of the real world, and my endless protection was the very thing that had made him so dangerously fragile, so easily seduced by the illusion of effortless wealth. I could legally stop the Sterlings from destroying him financially, but I could no longer protect him from the devastating emotional reality of who his biological parents truly were, and I could no longer save him from himself. My job as a protective father was officially over. My duty as a ruthless creditor was about to begin. The final pathetic insult arrived 3 days before the gala, pinging into my inbox at 2 in the afternoon. It wasn't a text from Julian, and it wasn't a call from Preston. It was a sterile, condescending email sent from the official corporate address of Eleanor Sterling's personal executive assistant. The subject line read, "Courtesy notification regarding country club security protocols." The body of the email was wrapped in thick, polite corporate jargon, but the underlying message was explicitly, cruelly clear. It stated that due to the exclusive nature of the Vanguard family's guest list and the strict dress codes enforced by the Sterling Country Club, The family felt it was best if I did not attempt to attend the engagement party. They claimed they wanted to avoid any aesthetic clashes or uncomfortable reminders of Julian's previous working-class living arrangements, as he officially integrated into his aristocratic bloodline, kindly advising me to stay at my house and celebrate from afar. I didn't reply to the email. I simply printed it out, folded it neatly into thirds, walked over to the heavy steel floor safe tucked beneath my desk, and placed it inside, right on top of the freshly oiled tool belt and the thick, legally binding folders containing the $18 million of defaulted mezzanine debt. I spun the combination lock until it clicked shut, finally accepting that the boy I had loved was entirely gone, replaced by an arrogant, willing pawn in a fraudulent game he didn't even understand. When the evening of the 21st finally arrived, I did not put on my steel-toe boots, my heavy denim jeans, or the faded flannel shirts Julian had found so deeply embarrassing. Instead, I walked into the master bedroom of my quiet craftsman house, reached into the very back of the cedar closet, and pulled out the heavy garment bag I hadn't opened in nearly a decade. Inside was a bespoke midnight blue suit, tailored specifically to my exact measurements in Milan, back when I had personally negotiated the acquisition of a massive commercial plaza in downtown Seattle. I stood in front of the hallway mirror, adjusting the heavy silk tie and buttoning the pristine, perfectly fitted jacket, barely recognizing the dangerous, unyielding businessman staring back at me. I looked nothing like the humble, dusty contractor my son thought he had discarded. I looked exactly like the man who actually owned the skyline they were all pretending to rule. I locked the front door of the empty house, walked past the oil-stained space in the driveway where my son used to park his car, and climbed into the cab of my vintage, restored 1972 Ford truck. I turned the ignition, feeling the heavy, reliable engine roar to life in the quiet suburban evening, and put the heavy truck into gear, turning the wheel toward the Sterling Country Club, entirely ready to tear down the false empire they had built and collect the debts they had arrogantly assumed I could never enforce. It took exactly 4 days for the borrowed glass castle to completely shatter, leaving nothing behind but jagged edges and the cold, unavoidable reality of the dirt beneath it. I was standing in the driveway of my quiet suburban home on a crisp Tuesday morning, wiping thick black engine grease off my hands with a red shop rag after replacing the alternator on my vintage Ford truck, when a faded yellow city taxi slowly turned onto the street. The brakes squealed sharply as it pulled up to the curb, a jarring contrast to the pristine, quiet neighborhood, and I watched through the morning mist as the passenger door opened. Julian climbed out, but he looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, designer-clad heir who had screamed at me in the country club boardroom just 96 hours earlier. His charcoal gray Milanese suit was severely wrinkled and stained, his expensive leather dress shoes were scuffed, and his posture was completely broken as he pulled a single, overstuffed canvas duffel bag from the back seat, the exact same bag he had arrogantly packed when he threw $5,000 onto my kitchen counter and walked out of my life. The leased Maserati was gone, repossessed by the dealership along with every other fraudulent luxury the Sterlings had rented to maintain their illusion. And as Julian dragged his feet up the concrete driveway toward me, his eyes red and swollen from days of crying, he looked exactly like the terrified, abandoned 4-year-old foster kid I had brought home 2 decades ago. He stopped a few feet away from the front bumper of my truck, his shoulders trembling as he dropped the heavy bag onto the pavement and launched into a desperate, breathless apology, his voice cracking as he begged me to let him move back into his old bedroom. He confessed that the moment I called in the $18 million debt and legally froze the Sterling Empire, Preston and Eleanor had completely vanished, abandoning their penthouse in the middle of the night to flee their aggressive short-term creditors, leaving Julian alone in a locked hotel room with absolutely nothing but a stack of voided contracts and a mountain of public humiliation. He told me he finally understood what true family meant, promising that he was ready to change, ready to listen, and ready to go back to the way things used to be before he was blinded by the illusion of his biological bloodline. I stood there in silence, listening to the agonizing sound of my son sobbing in my driveway, and for one brief, excruciating second, every paternal instinct in my body screamed at me to step forward, wrap my arms around him, carry his bags inside, and fix his entire world just like I always had. But I forced my boots to stay firmly planted on the concrete, looking at the boy I had loved enough to shield from every hardship in the world, finally accepting the devastating truth that my endless protection had been the very thing that made him so dangerously fragile. A master contractor knows that when a structure collapses due to a rotten foundation, you cannot simply patch the drywall and pretend the house is safe. You have to clear the site completely and force the new foundation to bear its own weight from the ground up. I did not raise my voice, and I did not offer him the warm, forgiving embrace he was so desperately expecting. But instead, I looked him dead in the eye and calmly explained that while I had stepped into that boardroom to stop him from being legally and financially destroyed by strangers, I was absolutely not going to shield him from the necessary, agonizing pain of starting completely over from zero. I reached into the open cab of my heavy-duty truck, pulled out the worn, freshly oiled leather tool belt I had rescued from his bedroom trash can 3 weeks ago, and held it out to him, watching his tear-streaked face contort in confusion as his shaking hands slowly took the heavy leather from my grasp. "You traded a father who loved you for a fantasy that didn't exist, Julian, and you told me you wanted to build your own life," I told him, my voice steady, resolute, and entirely devoid of the safety net he was begging for. "Start here." I didn't wait for him to formulate a response, and I didn't watch him cry. I simply turned around, walked up the wooden porch steps of the modest home I had built with my own 2 hands, and quietly closed the heavy oak front door, the solid click of the deadbolt echoing with the profound finality of a boundary that would never be crossed again. Leaving him standing alone in the driveway was the hardest thing I have ever done in my 62 years on this earth, but I knew it was the only way he would ever learn how to survive. The following morning, the crisp air inside the Vance commercial builder's office smelled reassuringly of fresh sawdust, rolled blueprint paper, and strong, dark roast coffee as I walked through the glass doors at 6 in the morning. Elena Cortez was already at her desk, entirely focused on her dual monitors as she expertly negotiated a massive concrete pour with a stubborn supplier over the phone, fighting for the integrity of my business with the fierce, unwavering dedication that my own son had never once bothered to learn. She finished the call, wiped a smudge of ink from her forehead, and smiled warmly as she pushed a steaming mug of black coffee across my cluttered drafting table, completely unaware of the profound gratitude swelling in my chest as I watched her work. In that quiet, ordinary moment surrounded by the chaotic noise of a growing commercial enterprise, I finally understood the truth about what holds a life together when the storms hit. True family isn't determined by shared genetics, grand aristocratic titles, or legal obligations printed on a birth certificate. It is forged entirely by the people who choose to stay in the dirt with you, the people who show up off the clock to help you pack up your grief, and the people who do the hard, invisible work of building a life alongside you day after day. Some foundations will inevitably crack under the toxic pressure of entitlement and unearned arrogance, but the structures forged in genuine loyalty, mutual respect, and shared sacrifice will always hold up the sky. For the first time in 20 years, as I unrolled a fresh set of blueprints and picked up my pencil, I was completely and entirely at peace with exactly what I had built. If you have ever had to do the hardest thing in the world and close the door on someone you deeply loved so they could finally learn how to stand on their own 2 feet, let me know your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more stories about the hard, necessary boundaries that keep our foundation strong.